Today, what I would like to talk about is about language learning in an English-speaking community in in Korea, more specifically in Seoul, and also in a few Japanese universities that I surveyed some years ago. I was interested to see if academics, foreign academics who work in Japan and in Korea, how much effort and how much interest they have and how much success ultimately they have in learning the local language of the host countries. So first off, expatriate academics or expat academics. So these are, a definition is internationally mobile academics employed full-time on tenure track positions outside their home countries. I think we all know examples of that, and many of us are expat academics. They play a role in global rankings of universities, usually because of foreign language teaching that they do or publishing in non-local journals. So there is some benefit to universities when they hire expat academics, and that's an international global trend, really. So it's going on everywhere in the world. And this internationalization of higher education is an important heading. And as I said, it's going on everywhere. Some nations see a larger influx of expat academics and some see less of it. But generally, it is a trend that can be observed worldwide. Here are a few words on expat faculty in Korea. So in Korea, there was an effort to hire expat faculty members. That was around the turn of the millennium, really. Between 2003 and 2013, it was a fourfold increase in foreign hires. And again, I'm talking about people on tenure track positions. So by 2014, there were about 6.5% of all faculty members, sorry, who came from outside of Korea. A peak was in 2013, over 7% of faculty population was foreign. And according to the latest numbers I could find by Douglas Gress in his recent publication, in 2020, it was approximately 5%. So there was a small decline here. The situation in Japan, internationalization dates back a little bit longer, but it increased in the 1980s. So they introduced programs aimed at bringing a larger numbers of international students and teachers to Japan. And by 2016, around 4% of tenure track positions were held by expat academics. So around 4, 5, 6% is in both of the countries. So there are various challenges, of course, associated with the integration of these faculty members in general, again, globally, everywhere. But there are some in East Asian education that are pretty specific for East Asia in general. I guess every country has its specific challenges, of course, for foreigners living there. And as we all know, that what influences your life, your satisfaction with your job and your workplace, your productivity, your personal success. There are so many factors that influence that. Your cultural participation, your social interaction with colleagues, then organizational things like clarity of rules and regulations, for instance, concerning promotion. That is a big concern for many tenure track foreigners, of course. And there are many other things, childcare, a myriad of reasons, of course. So it can't just be one or a few factors that influence that. It's a psychologically very complex phenomenon, obviously, and depends a lot on an individual, him or herself. But generally, it is, I guess most people would agree that integrating into the culture and the place where you live is a good thing and is usually what people want to do. So there are 3 distinct facets of cultural adjustments that were proposed. So it is a general adjustment to living in a foreign country. Then it's what's called interaction adjustment with the locals, and then work adjustment. So these 3 are actually pretty important to most people. And then interaction adjustment has this core feature of linguistic integration. So that is learning the local language. And it's often considered as the most problematic of all these adjustment types. And I think everyone who's ever learned a foreign language can probably attest to that. It is really difficult. And language learning requires so much more than just saying, I want to do that. So much of a personal disposition and ability and time and all of these things. So yeah, it is certainly very, very complex skill. In general, English is the lingua franca of academia. But if you live in a country, you can't just survive with English most of the time. You may survive quite well, but there will be some situations where you will need to know the local language, or where you want to know the local language. And another thing that shouldn't be underestimated is, of course, that you're placing a burden on the local colleagues. Everybody has to do everything for you in English, and that is a little bit of a burden to some degree. For some people, it's more of a burden, for others, it's less. I have to say, I'm really grateful to my former colleagues who always made such a great effort to translate everything for me into German and to have department meetings in German and explain things in German. So, and I do recognize that it is a little bit of a burden for people to do that. And I'm really grateful for that. But that is really not the case for every foreign academic, it has to be said. Some departments are less willing to do that. So some have more problems than others. So the present study, now I was interested in the question, how proficient are expat academics whose native language is English? Because I tried to focus on a homogeneous linguistic group. So how proficient are they in the local languages in their host countries of Korea and Japan? We all know that language learning is profoundly impacted by one's native language. So rather than survey all foreign academics, I thought it would make most sense to focus on those that share one native language. And then the second question was, how ready and willing are you to undertake language study? How much of an effort do you put into your language studies? So some variables that I investigated are personal aptitude to language learning, so a special talent for language learning. Some people have more of a talent than others. I asked people how they rate themselves in terms of their aptitude. Then I asked them how much time they spend studying the language. I asked them about their willingness to integrate into society. So do they have a desire to become part of the foreign culture? And do they prioritize learning the local language, or do they choose to live in a little silo, essentially, of a foreign bubble, only talking to foreigners and not willing to integrate into society? And there are people like that. I mean, everywhere, people like that exist everywhere. But fortunately, not too many. And then I asked them about the time spent in a foreign country, because of course, the longer they are there, you would think that the psychological bond becomes stronger, and then people tend to increase their study efforts and want to become more proficient in the host language. And then I also asked them about work-life balance. So language study is time-consuming. I think we all know that. And in particular, if the language is not typologically related to one's native language, so many differences, few cognates, and it becomes really hard for English speakers to learn Japanese or Korean. They're very distant languages in typologically speaking. So this requires a learner to devote even more time to studying the language than if it was a typologically related language. And generally, spare time is scarce for any professor on tenure track, certainly in Korea and also in Japan. And for expat professors, that's the same. So everybody works hard, everybody works long hours. There's intense publishing pressure. And it was my reasoning that the more time someone uses for language study, the less time they have to subtract this from their working time, essentially. Sorry. So these were the hypotheses. So the host language proficiency is predicted by good language learning aptitude, increased study effort, and the individually perceived needs to learn the language. And then the study effort I predicted to be influenced by good language learning aptitude. A good language learner will invest more study effort because they usually have more success. Then a person's willingness to integrate into the society, the time he or she has spent in the country, and then decreased work productivity. So it seems pretty straightforward. So my methods were I surveyed expat faculty members originating from North America, so the United States and from Canada, the English-speaking countries in North America, on tenure track positions at 6 Korean and 8 Japanese universities and research institutions. It was an anonymous online survey, and I asked them about their attitudes and the experiences with learning Korean and Japanese. The requirement was that they learned these languages as a second language. So ethnic Korean and Japanese professors that had foreign nationalities were not included. And the survey was open between December 2017 and April 2018. So here are some variables that I measured. So the single measure variables, the self-reported Korean Japanese language skill. I asked them to rate on an ordinate scale from 1 to 5. How good is your Korean or your Japanese? And then the self-reported good language learning ability. So I just asked them, are you a good language learner or not? So yes or no. Then the number of foreign languages in which they had reached an intermediate level. So intermediate is the B1, B2 in these European framework reference stages. Then how many hours a week they spent studying the language, the numbers of semesters they had been employed in the host countries, and then how willing are you to participate in the local culture from 1 to 5. So I'm very willing, or I don't care at all. And then the perceived needs to learn the local language to navigate social and professional lives. So measured from 1 is no need, and then 3 is I feel an urgent need to learn the local language. Had some composite variables where study effort was composed of the average weekly study hours and the percentage of time in the host country that the participants had taken language classes. So I also asked them in percentage, so how many of the semesters that you have spent there were you enrolled in language classes and actively participating in language classes? Then language learning aptitude was good language learning skills and having learned a number of foreign languages. And then work productivity, I measured as a composite of average weekly work hours. And then the number of first author publications within the last 2 years to have some kind of measure. These are not perfect, but I think they're good proxy variables for what I'm trying to look at. So some cases of highly proficient speakers were excluded then, because I would suspect that someone who's highly proficient does not enroll in language classes, does not spend much time studying the language at all. So they were excluded. So I did linear regression, and it had a qualitative part. In the qualitative part, I asked the participants, so what do you consider as the biggest problem that prevents you from engaging more in intensive language study or from achieving a higher proficiency in the language? The sample size was 45 participants, so 28 from Korea, 17 from Japanese research institutions. And here are some results now. So in terms of language proficiency, so you see the blue line is for the people working in Japan, and the gray is for people in Korea. When you look at this, the good news is that nobody said, I don't know any Korean or Japanese. So the lowest, no proficiency at all, nobody had that. But then the next level was, I know some phrases, I can greet people, order food, coffee, give directions to taxi drivers, very, very basic. And you see that's the majority of expats in Korea. It was still quite a few people in Japan, but not as many. So it's almost twice as many of the foreigners in Korea. Then I can have short and simple conversations. then I'm confident talking with colleagues and other people. So you see, the Korean expats, very few of them actually achieve that level. But if you look at the bars in general, you see that the expats in Japan, they generally had a higher proficiency here. So many of them could actually participate in department meetings, give academic presentations. That's a very high level. You had almost none in Korea. Then here's a comparison. So the host countries and then these variables that I just described, language learning skills. In general, the Japanese sample, they reported higher language learning skills. The Korean sample, I mean, they had very similar numbers for foreign languages learned. Then you see the Japanese sample again had higher skills, reported higher language skills, 3.47 between 1 and 5. So 1 was no skill and 5 was very good skill. The willingness to integrate was also a bit higher in the Japanese sample. The perceived need to learn the language was quite similar, I would say. Weekly study hours were even more in the Korean sample, and the percentage of time in the country enrolled in class. So it was 32%, a third of the time for the Japanese sample, but only 17.8% for the Korean sample. So here is the result of the first linear regression in study effort, and you see what is significant is that can significantly predict the study effort is work productivity and the language aptitude. And so the better language learning aptitude, of course, leads to higher study effort because you're more successful at learning the language, you feel motivated to learn it. But with work productivity, it was more study effort when there was less productivity. And that also makes sense. Learning a language, going to class takes time from your from work, of course. The willingness to integrate in the host society or the semesters someone had spent living in the country had no influence on their study effort. And now the second regression was about the proficiency that was achieved. So how do you predict the proficiency achieved? And here we have being a good language learner, that helps a lot, having learned a high number of languages, and then the weekly study hours. So yeah, this is all, I think, very intuitive to most people. The personal predisposition to language learning, of course, plays a major role in learning success. And if you, a lack of language learning experience, so if you haven't really learned many foreign languages and you don't have a good language learning skills, that makes it really difficult, of course, for people to learn this typologically very different language. And this can result in relatively low proficiency, even after many hours of instruction. So for the Japanese sample, proficiency generally was higher in the Japanese samples, and professors working at these institutions reported overall better language abilities, but fewer weekly study hours, and that makes sense because they already come with better Japanese skills, so you invest less time studying the language, or traditional study, of course, of the language. And so that is an agreement with what we know from the literature, so that more expat academics arrive in Japan with Japanese language skills. So a high number of them have actually graduated from Japanese universities. And in general, one could say that maybe local language proficiency is considered more important for Japanese hiring practices. That may be the case. In Korea, it's the case that a large majority of professors have been educated abroad, often the United States or Europe. And in general, they create a more multilingual work experience at their departments. So it is, for foreigners, it's easier to come and then just not learn Korean because you will be accommodated by the multilingual Korean colleagues. Here, the qualitative results. So I asked people what is the greatest obstacle for you to invest more time and achieve a high proficiency. Of course, number one, lack of time. 36 people said that. Then number two was the language is too difficult. the level to acquire a level that is necessary for work and social life, a lack of opportunity to practice with native speakers. So that sounds counterintuitive, of course, if you live in a country surrounded by native speakers of language. And that's usually a problem that second language learners in their home countries have, that they can't find someone who speaks that language that they learn. But here it's, we'll see that later, that people don't get the opportunity to speak that language because all the Koreans and the Japanese they all know English and then speak English to the people. Some listed personal reasons, like I don't want to learn the language. I'm not motivated or disciplined enough to learn it. I'm a bad language learner, so I'm not even going to try. Then 5, some people said lack of institutional support or encouragement. Then some said the language skill is not considered necessary or important. There is no benefit to learning the language. And then some people commented on the suboptimal language pedagogy in classes or high cost of classes even. So in general, the perceived need to learn the language had no impact on the actual language skill. So the majority of participants, everybody essentially agreed that learning the language is essential for working and living in the host country. But this perceived need did not translate into any more study effort or better language skills. And they often justified the insufficient proficiency with learning difficulties due to this linguistic difference that I said between English and Japanese or Korean. So it's just too difficult to learn, essentially, many people said. Here are some quotes of what people actually said. I've taken night classes for 6 hours a week, a simple class for faculty, 2 hours a week, done intensive language exchanges for 2 summers. Even so, I have not quite reached the point at which I can truly gain fluency like I have in 4 other languages. Someone else said, never reaching the level where meaningful conversations can be made, and there is no career benefits to Korean proficiency below native level. So overall, the study effort was quite modest by both groups. The majority of respondents had attended Korean classes for some time of their time in Korea. There were 25% of low proficiency learners that had never taken a class, and that is surprising. So these 25% had never even tried. So in Japan, people also attended Japanese classes during the employment period. The average time spent studying Japanese was 1.3 hours a week. But as I said, they studied less time a week studying the language, but they overall had a better language proficiency. So here are some more quotes. Between work, family, physical fitness, and church, it's hard to have the time to learn Korean language and culture as I would like. Or finding the time to study Korean is the biggest challenge given the pressures placed on international faculty to publish. And one Japanese participant said, time needed to study Japanese would otherwise detract from my fulfillment of professional responsibilities and expectations. Here's some sentiments on the classes. So people thought that classes are designed for 20-somethings or housewives from Southeast Asia or Russia. Some thought the teaching method is arcane, focused too much on grammar rather than communicative Korean. Textbooks seem to be mostly held over from the 80s, focused too much on business Japanese. So people, when they took classes, some of them thought that the classes weren't appropriate for them. And generally, Koreans, and I guess also some of the Japanese sample did comment on this ubiquity of the English language in those two countries. Korean people are generally unwilling to speak Korean slowly. They always speak English, no matter how many times I ask them to speak Korean so I can practice. So this is what they said before, the comment on not finding native speakers to talk to. Many Japanese want to speak English to us instead of Japanese. And then here, I thought this was an interesting comment. 2 people had the comment about the non-transportable asset. So Korean and Japanese are not commonly taught foreign languages from a global viewpoint. And some people thought that learning it is for very specific purposes only, learning Korean and Japanese. Giving up time from either family or career to learn something which is time intensive and doesn't help me much if I leave Korea. or Korean being a language isolate, it doesn't offer the opportunity to use it in a number of places. So they thought it would be so specific to learn Japanese or Korean just for this little, just for the workplace or for very specific social activities, but it doesn't help them much outside of Korea and Japan. But it has to be said that both of these are becoming more popular second languages, Korean and Japanese globally. So this is increasing, that people like to learn Korean and Japanese. Now a few words on the conclusion. So expat experience is of course biased by country of origin and very much a person's experiences, of course. Some of the findings, I would say, are not just restricted to North American academics. There are many common issues that apply to all expat faculty equally. And as I said before, language learning is impacted by one's native language. So maybe the language learning aspect of cultural integration, there is a lot of bias by country of origin, language of origin. So I think expat academics that speak maybe East Asian languages that are a little bit typologically closer to Korean, but Korean is an isolate. I think it doesn't have many related languages, but they might find it easier to become a bit more proficient in Korean than the North American English speakers. Okay, and here are some of my references.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Luef.